Greetings. Those of you that were with us the last time know that we were talking about Reconstruction, and specifically we're talking about the time period that comes in the aftermath of the Civil War. Now, I spent quite a good time the last time we met discussing how and why Reconstruction is so important to the grand scheme of things in American history. The way that I've always liked to think of it is it's essentially a reset button. It's an opportunity to get something right that we didn't exactly get right the first time around. Now, like everything else that we've talked about in this class, time periods have a tendency to come to an end, and Reconstruction is no exception to that rule. Today what we're going to be talking about is the undoing of Reconstruction. Now, for your quiz, I've asked you to take a look at two documents. They're political cartoons by a cartoonist named Thomas Nast, and get you to think about what exactly it was that was going on in American history that led to the undermining and eroding of the Reconstruction process in American political history. I want to point something out very, very quickly. The rebellion of the white South as it related to the federal government's attempt to reconstruct that part of the country in a way that was more reflective of the ideals of the American Revolution, that was only part of the undoing of Reconstruction. Without Northern acquiescence, Northern lack of willpower, that is, to continue on in the process of reconstructing the South, even one full-scale rebellion would not have been enough to undermine this whole process. That's where I want to begin today. I want to talk to you about the White South's effort to undermine the process of Reconstruction. Now, to do this, I need you to understand something. Before the Civil War, the way that black people, both free and enslaved, were kept in their place according to the racist caste system had usually been through legal codification. Those of you that were with us in the beginning of the semester will remember me talking about black codes and slave codes and things of that sort. Now, obviously in the aftermath of the Civil War, especially in the aftermath of radical Reconstruction, much of that legal ability to restrict the rights and privileges of black people has been eliminated, okay? And when that happened, for all intents and purposes, the South turned to unrestricted, unadulterated violence. We were talking about this a little bit the last time when we begin to get into our discussion of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, what I'd like to point out before we go any further is the White South had considered Reconstruction to be an abomination. In a lot of opinions, this was the North's attempt to not only destroy the Southern way of life, but in a lot of ways completely humiliate the South through what was considered to be colored rule. In other words, the rule and the subjugation of white America at the hands of black America. Now, to really right that ship as they saw it, what you saw was the emergence of what came to be known as Southern Redeemers. Okay? Now, the word redemption typically means something good in our culture, but in this case, what I want you to understand about Southern redemption, this is about putting the white South, the South generally speaking, back on the pre-Civil War course as it related to the racist social order. Now, the classic institution that we need to talk about as it relates to violence is the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan emerges late in the 1860s, in the middle of Reconstruction, in the middle of radical Reconstruction. And it emerges in the western part of Tennessee. Now, one of the individuals that I asked you to look at in that Thomas Nast cartoon for your quiz was an individual named Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, Nathan Bedford Forrest was one of the most decorated Civil War generals of the war. He was a very well-accomplished cavalry general, and he was also the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, in the late 1860s, he was in the middle of rebuilding his pre-Civil War fortune when some of these redeemers came to him and asked him to start this organization. Now, for your notes, what the Ku Klux Klan essentially is, at least by our standards, would be a terrorist organization. They would go on night rides, they would terrorize black communities, they would terrorize white Republicans in the South, or even white people that had anything to do with the Republican Party. They would terrorize Northerners that had come down to the South to rebuild it or take advantage of the economic opportunities that it presented. At any rate, what you're talking about is a terrorist organization that bombed buildings, burned churches, murdered people, the like. But it's important for you to understand that the Klan themselves did not see themselves as such. As far as they were concerned, they were a political tool, and they were putting the South back on course to get things straight again, as far as they were concerned. Okay. Now, obviously, this is going to provoke a response from the federal government. Okay. In 1871, after the Ku Klux Klan had not only reared its head, but had made it be well known that it was a force to be reckoned with, the federal government really did two things. First of all, in 1871, the federal government issued the Kkk Act. Now, what the Kkk Act did was it made membership in the Klan illegal, and it defined the Ku Klux Klan as an illegal terrorist institution. The second thing that the government did was it really picked up its efforts, its initiative when it comes to prosecuting the Klan. Okay? Now, this required a lot of manpower. It took a lot of law enforcement officials. It took more troops that were standing in the South, Tennessee and South Carolina in particular, just to name a few states. But what I need you to understand is, by the early 1870s, the federal government had made a good push when it comes to dealing with the Ku Klux Klan. As a matter of fact, in 1872, 1873, it was estimated that in South Carolina alone, the government had tried and punished in some form or fashion upwards of 9,000 Klansmen. Now, here's the issue. Essentially, what the North is doing, still doing, I guess I should say, is having a military occupation of the South. Now, obviously, this can't go on and on forever. I mean, there's limited resources, and more importantly, there's a limited tolerance of the Northern public for continuing on with this whole process. So, the point that I really want to press upon you is, yes, of course, the Ku Klux Klan is a really big problem, and yes, of course, the federal government is aware of this, but the fact of the matter is, you've really got two choices here. You can either begin to pull out of places like Tennessee and South Carolina, hand the government over to the people that are supposed to be running it, of the Southern persuasion, hope for the best, or you can get in a little bit deeper and understand deeper means more time, more men, more resources, more money. It's a very controversial issue, and it's ultimately one where the federal government decided to back off a bit. Now, I want to explain something else as it relates to the Ku Klux Klan. In the aftermath of being labeled a terrorist organization, the Klan found various ways to reinvent itself. And one of the ways that it found to reinvent itself was the formation of what came to be known as rifle clubs across the white South. Now, these rifle clubs are exactly what they sound like. They were a group of men that were essentially gun enthusiasts, but they were really a code word for the new and upcoming Ku Klux Klan. Okay? So it's not as if the Klan just simply disappears in 1871 after the federal government declares it an illegal terrorist organization. Okay? Now, there's something else that we ought to talk about before we go any further. By the 1870s, this is not your grandfather's Republican Party any longer, okay? Keep in mind, the Republican Party came about basically as the vehicle for anti-slavery. It was a platform, that's really what produced your Abraham Lincoln types. By the 1870s, you've got a new generation of Republican politicians that are coming to Washington and coming of age, generally speaking. Now, if this is not enough, you've got a whole new set of issues, problems really, that the North itself is facing. For those of you that go on to take History 1302, you're going to understand that the 1870s through the 90s are going to be a very tumultuous time when it comes to labor relations in the United States. You've got labor problems, you've got industrial expansion, you've got a lot of different things that these Northern Republicans have to keep their eye on now. Adding into all of this complication is the fact that the Grant administration was not as proactive when it comes to using the federal government to implement radical Reconstruction as the radical Republican Congress had been right through the election of 1868 that elected U.S. Grant to the president. So you take this and you combine it with some of the Supreme Court rulings that are coming out during this period, such as the U.S. versus Cruikshank Decision in 1876, which emphasized if civil rights violations have in fact been made, it would be up to the state of Alabama, the state of Georgia, the state of Tennessee to enforce them. In other words, what the Supreme Court is saying in U.S. versus Cruikshank is that the federal government really doesn't have the authority to enforce these civil rights laws that we were talking about the last time we met. The 1866 Civil Rights Bill, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. What U.S. versus Cruikshank is essentially saying is, yes, that's a federal law, but when it comes to the enforcement of that federal law, that's essentially a state right issue. All of this is leading us into the perfect storm in 1876. 1876 is an election year, and one of the best kept secrets in American history is how corrupt the Grant administration was. Now, I'm not accusing U.S. Grant himself of being corrupt. I'm simply saying that he had surrounded himself with a collection of people that were really opportunist, and Grant simply happened to be a nice guy. A lot of people took advantage of that. But anyway, back to the point. If you're a Republican, what you want to do is you want to run a real straight arrow in 1876. The individual that they run is a guy from Ohio with a pretty squeaky clean record, a guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. Okay? Now, there's not anything necessarily to worry about with Hayes, but there's also nothing that's going to make you fall in love with Hayes either. The Democrats nominate a guy from New York, a rich lawyer by the name of Samuel Tilden. Okay? Now, I could tell you a lot of things about Samuel Tilden, but the one thing that I really want to press upon you, Tilden favored home rule for the South. Home rule. And think about that for just a second. Now, obviously, this is going to set really, really well with the South, and he's going to receive a lot of votes in the South, not only because he's a Democrat, but also because he's saying, if you elect me, I'm going to let you take over the process of Reconstruction and essentially end it. Okay? Now, what this is saying to Northern voters is basically the same thing. He's basically coding the idea that if you elect me, I'll end Reconstruction. In other words, I'm not going to sit here and micromanage the process of Reconstruction, rebuilding the South, as my predecessors have up until this point. Okay? Now, 1876 was an incredibly tight election, and it is an election that Rutherford B. Hayes is going to lose the popular vote. Now, although he's losing in the popular vote, it's still possible for him to win the presidency if 3 states go to him in the Electoral College. We're talking about South Carolina, we're talking about Louisiana, and ironically enough, we're talking about Florida. Now, it just so happened that Republican politicians were in power in each one of those states. So once the Hayes camp figures this whole process out, that if those 3 states go to him, he's going to win the election even though he'll lose the popular vote. What they do is they stop the election citing voter fraud, okay? And it is determined that whoever is ahead at that particular moment when the election is stopped, that person will be the individual that wins in each one of those states. Well, the people that were in charge were also very close to the Hayes camp, and they determined that Hayes won each and every one of these states. So that gave him a very small margin of victory in the Electoral College, but nonetheless it gave him a victory, or so they said. There's outrage in Democratic circles. The South is on the cusp of reseceding, truth be known. So anyway, there is a committee that is assembled to look into this, and there are 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and I don't need to spend a whole lot of time trying to explain to you how that vote went down. So it's pretty obvious that this is not going to be resolved through recounts or anything along those lines. What we get is one of the most important decisions made in American history. Incredibly, incredibly important issue. The Compromise of 1877. Now, for your notes, part of this compromise was that Rutherford B. Hayes was determined to be the president of the election. President of the United States. He's determined to be the winner of the election of 1876. Now, the Republicans got what they wanted, which is 4 more years of a Republican presidency. And that begs the question, what did the Democrats get? What did the South in particular get? Well, the truth of that matter may never be known, but what we do know is upon winning the White House, Hayes does appoint several individuals within the Tilden campaign to positions within his presidency, right? In other words, he gets them nice, cushy posts within the Hayes administration. Now, the less direct, less vivid thing that we understand is exactly what Hayes promised as it related to Reconstruction. We don't necessarily know that there was some smoky backroom deal that was hatched at the 11th hour to assuage everybody, but what we do know is Hayes's first order of business as President of the United States was to order the troops back to Washington. In other words, when he became president, one of the first things that Rutherford B. Hayes did was he pulled out all of the troops from the South, ordered them back to their barracks in Washington. Now ask yourself why that is important. Think about that for a second. Up until 1876, it had been the troops that were stationed all across the South, that were the only thing that stood in between the African American community and complete apartheid, right? Separate societies, no votes for the African American community, no representation in various forms of government, separate schools, separate neighborhoods, separate hotels, separate accommodations of every imaginable type. So the point that I want to make with this Compromise of 1876, this is the federal government essentially washing its hands of the African American community in the United States. It's essentially throwing them to their fate as it relates to the racist caste system. The most important thing that I can emphasize when it comes to the Compromise of 1877, the most important part of all of this, is in the aftermath of this decision to pull out the troops, the United States will enter into arguably the darkest time period in American history as it relates to race relations. Okay? Very quickly, what sets in is a legal system that essentially excludes African Americans from all aspects of mainstream life. It disfranchises them in the sense that it essentially creates all of these sneaky laws that are designed to take away the vote from the African American community. It segregates every single feasible aspect of life in the South, everything from schools to restaurants to hotels to professions. There was no minor detail that was spared. More than anything else, what it did was it instilled a culture that was buttressed by both poverty and violence. It instilled a culture of second, arguably even third-class citizenship for African Americans. So I want you to think about this as we wrap up our class for the semester. For the last 15 weeks or so, we've been talking about this idea of America the Great Exception, and America being the only place in the world where you could be born into humble origins and you could rise as high as your talents would take you, and it didn't matter about your background, the color of your skin, the language that you spoke, anything like that. I mean, it was merely about the merits of your character, the content of your character. We had come close to really achieving that a couple of different times in this class. Once in 1783, when we had won our independence in the American Revolutionary War. We had eliminated the idea that kings, and popes, and dukes, and bishops should be ruling and everybody else should simply fall in line simply because that was the natural order of things. We saw that we had made good progress with that, but we had essentially kept open an evil institution like that of slavery that had essentially poisoned not only the concepts of freedom and equality between the races, but you could clearly see that slavery was a rich man's institution that had not only concentrated the wealth, but concentrated the political power in the hands of the very, very few. In 1865, we got that reset button, and we had made good progress through the late 1860s when it comes to taking full advantage of this reset button in American history. The problem was this is a process that's going to take an awful long time to really solidify. And so therefore, what I want to leave you with in this semester is we had made progress as it relates to Reconstruction. And the most basic of levels, what we did was we implemented the laws that would be necessary for people like Martin Luther King, people like Cesar Chavez, people like Harvey Milk, to ask that fundamental question, why, in the 20th century, and to a lesser extent the 21st century, if you're talking about History 1301. So on the surface level, we got that second chance with Reconstruction, and we blew it. I mean, there's no other way of putting it other than that way. Reconstruction fails to deliver on its promises of freedom, equality for all, regardless of skin color, religiosity, ethnicity, background, things of that sort. It fails. But what it does succeed in doing is laying a foundational legal reference point, for lack of a better way of putting it, that will allow individuals to come back and point to this later on in the 1960s when college students begin sitting down at lunch counters and saying, we're not leaving until you serve us lunch, because that's what the federal government says we have a right to have. Later in the 1970s, when women start asking the question why, a lot of them will point to the concepts, the Revolutionary era concepts of all men being created equal. So, as I'm hopeful that you're aware by now, this is an incredibly, incredibly important time period in American history. With that being said, I want to thank you for your attentiveness this semester. It really has been a pleasure working with you. And as always, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me, so please don't be a stranger. Thank you.